like me very much at Southern Miss. The joke around the department is that I am slightly to the right of Genghis Khan, and which is what they tell new professors that come in and to watch out, don't get me as a TA. So everybody around there is scared of me for some reason. And you probably ask, why is that? You're about to find out. So my topic this morning is our lost political heritage of the Jeffersonian tradition, the Jeffersonian ideal, or as I like to call it, the Jeffersonian conservatism, and the revolution that tried to kill it and has nearly succeeded in doing so. Really, when you're discussing reasons for Southern secession, as if the South needed to produce one, perhaps the most important was the protection of the Jeffersonian ideal, the right to self-government, the right to govern themselves. The principles that made up this philosophy, Jefferson called them, they're timeless principles. They're really the true ideals of the Revolution. Jefferson called them the bright constellation. Millard Fillmore, a one-time Northern Whig, it said they represented a beautiful fabric and a priceless inheritance. For James Buchanan, it was the ideals embodied in the unshaken rock of the Constitution that could keep the nation from falling into division and faction if they're adhered to. Now, that's not to say we've been free of political disputes. We've always had political disputes. We always will have political disputes. With the ratification of the Constitution, we had a dispute between the Federalists and the Anti-Federalists. That battle spilled into an ideological fight between Jefferson and Hamilton and Washington's cabinet, as you know. That created the two-party system, gave us the first two parties we have. The Federalists, or the Hamiltonians, we can call them, believed in a strong central government, a national banking system, a paper fiat currency, a national debt, high protective tariffs, internal taxes, direct aid or subsidies to corporations. They believed in a loose construction of the Constitution, the suppression of civil liberties with the Alien and Sedition Acts, and an internationalist, energetic foreign policy. The Republicans, or the Jeffersonians, now not to be confused with the later Republican Party under Lincoln, believed in limited government. They believed in the opposite things: federalism, sound money, low taxes, low tariffs, no national debt, government separation from banks, no subsidies for businesses or corporations, a strict construction of the Constitution, including protection of civil liberties for the people, and a non-interventionist foreign policy. Simply put, Hamiltonians believed in the merits of an energetic national government. Jeffersonians believed in decentralization and trusted in the people to govern themselves. Now, during the first 12 years of our new government under Washington and Adams, Hamilton, as you know, set to undo the limited government established by the Constitution. As Don mentioned last night, he called it a frail and worthless fabric. He told Washington one time, we need a government of more energy. And that's what he sought to create by subverting the new Constitution. So under Washington, Federalist arguments won out over Jeffersonian ones, at least on domestic policy. The government created a national bank, chartered a corporation, which is an early forerunner to the Federal Reserve, levied an array of internal taxes that included duties on land, alcohol, and even snuff, if you partake in that, and began running up a national debt, which Hamilton believed would be a national blessing. By contrast, the Jeffersonian Madison called a public debt a public curse, and certainly it was. Now consider the contrast here. Americans had only recently concluded a war of independence against Great Britain, with taxation being a major issue. I was listening to one historian one time, and he was talking about the tea tax. And he said you'd have had to drink a gallon of tea a day to pay $1 in taxes for the year. Now, I like my tea, but I don't like it that much. So we're talking about a very small tax here. And if you consider what Mather Byles supposedly said, he's the guy that said, which is better, to be ruled by one tyrant 3,000 miles away or 3,000 tyrants 1 mile away. Now look at the situation that Americans faced under the Federalists. In addition to state and local taxes, citizens now face taxation from the federal government on several articles, which caused many to wonder, why did we even break from Britain? We were probably better off there. This is especially true after the Whiskey Rebellion, when the national government under Hamilton's direction used military force to collect these taxes. So what had really changed? Some believe it's worse now than it was under the British. As Murray Rothbard has written, quote, "To the average American, the federal government's assumption of the power to impose excise taxes did not look very different from the levies of the British Crown," and they didn't. So by the time we get to the Adams administration from 1797 to 1801, things had gotten even worse. In 1798, the government suppressed civil liberties with the Alien and Sedition Acts, a series of 4 new laws designed specifically to quash the followers of Jefferson. They were very political in their scope. 3 of them were crackdowns on immigration. And the reason that they did that was because most of the new immigrants from Europe were joining the Republican Party, and the Federalists didn't like that. And, of course, the worst is the Sedition Act, and a lot of these had sunset provisions on them. They expired right after the election of 1800 because they didn't need them anymore after that. Sedition Act passed just 7 years after the Bill of Rights. I mean, the ink wasn't even dry on the Bill of Rights, and this bill punished political speech so that the administration could and did crack down and punish Jeffersonian newspaper editors. Many of them went to jail, including Benjamin Franklin's own grandson. Now, this all proved too much for the American people. This is not the road they wanted to travel down. So in the election of 1800, Jefferson and his Republican Party won an overwhelming victory, taking the White House and both houses of Congress. It's a triumph that Jefferson himself predicted, stopped the big government offensive, and it really killed the Federalist Party. The Federalists never saw power again, ever. That had been put to rest. Jefferson called it the Revolution of 1800, but it was one of ballots, not bullets. As the new president, Jefferson immediately instituted what he termed in his first inaugural address as a wise and frugal government, which shall restrain men from injuring one another, shall leave them otherwise free to regulate their own pursuits of industry and improvement, and shall not take from the mouth of labor the bread it has earned. This, he said, is the sum of good government. He then laid out what he considered the essential principles of our government, and I'm not going to try to read them all. You've probably read Jefferson's first inaugural. If we hadn't, please do so today. It's very good. But I will mention just a few things that he mentioned. Equal and exact justice to all men, peace, commerce, and honest friendship with all nations, entangling alliances with none, the support of the state governments and all of their rights as the most competent administrations for our domestic concerns and the surest bulwark against anti-republican tendencies, civil over the military authority, economy in the public expense, so that labor may be lightly burdened. That'd be nice today. The honest payment of our debts. These are the principles he considered timeless. And he concluded with these words: "These principles form the bright constellation which has gone before us and guided our steps through an age of revolution and reformation. The wisdom of our sages and blood of our heroes have been devoted to their attainment. They should be the creed of our political faith, the text for civic instruction, the touchstone by which to try the services of those we trust. And should we wander from them in moments of error or alarm, let us hasten to retrace our steps and regain the road which alone leads to peace, liberty, and safety." As president, Jefferson put all these principles into practice. He cut spending, eliminated all the internal taxes, repealed the Alien and Sedition Act, pardoned everybody that had been prosecuted under it, and if you had been fined, they gave you your money back out of the public treasury. By the time he left the presidency in 1809, all of Hamilton's taxes had been abolished to prevent what Jefferson called the bottomless abyss of public money, which is what we have today, right? It's an abyss. The federal budget under the Federalists was $5 million a year. Jefferson cut that more than half. It was only $2.4 million by the time he left office. The national debt reduced from $80 million to $57 million. The Treasury had a surplus of $14 million, which is a lot of money. It's peanuts now, but it was a lot of money then. But he also did something else to change the nature of the government. He changed its appearance. As you know, and in Jefferson's opinion, the office of the presidency had taken on the style of a monarch, which is exactly what Hamilton wanted. So he ended every practice that remotely resembled a king. such as the practice of publicly delivering the State of the Union address. Jefferson sent a written message because he said the king opens Parliament every year with a message, and publicly delivered it. He wanted to end that. Now, his predecessor certainly played the part of making it look like a monarch, which he didn't like. Washington and Adams, they were all decked out and had fancy carriages and horses and then parades. And I think Adams wore an elegant sword to his inaugural. I don't know what he was doing with a sword, but he had one. And, you know, he wanted to give a very kingly title for the presidency, His Highness the President of the United States and Defender of the Rights of the Same. And Jefferson hated all this stuff. And he changed it. Starting on Inauguration Day, he wore a simple suit. He didn't have a powdered wig. He wore shoes that laced rather than with an aristocratic buckle. Didn't ride in a fancy carriage. He walked from his boarding house to the Capitol to give his inaugural address. When he resided in the White House, he didn't have servants around there. If you knocked on the front door, President Jefferson answered it. If he was in his pajamas and robe, then so be it. He had a large rectangular table in there where they dined. He had that taken out, and he put a circular table. So if you dine with the president, everybody was equal. So what he was saying was, you know, I'm just a citizen like everybody else. I'm no different. He served food himself. He didn't have servants do these kind of things. Now, these changes may seem trivial and inconsequential, but it ushered in an era of Republican simplicity for the country, and it fit perfectly with the Jeffersonian ideal. And that's why I have a portrait of Jefferson in my office. And somebody asked me one time, said, well, why do you have a portrait of Jefferson in your office? I said, because my wife won't let me have it in the living room. This one. And when she's gone on a trip or something, I put it in there. So for over the next 60 years, with only a few exceptions, the nation was governed by these Jeffersonian principles, operating eventually in what would become the modern Democratic Party. Though it took some time, the Jeffersonians eventually repealed Hamilton's entire program, including the ultimate destruction of the Bank of the United States and the elimination of the national debt under Andrew Jackson. Jeffersonian America was the freest and most prosperous place on earth at the time. There were no federal taxes, no regulations, no federal police force, no standing army. Sounds like paradise to me. Americans had soundly rejected the centralizing ideas of Hamilton and the Federalists and determined that Jefferson carried the sacred fire of liberty, the true ideals of the Revolution. Now, although Jefferson and his ideas governed the country for these 60 years, it's easy for us to sometimes refer to it as Southern conservatism or Southern philosophy, and I certainly do. I mean, Southerners largely crafted them and upheld them. But we must not forget these are actually American ideals and American principles, American policies. Most Americans believe that, even Northerners did. As Don said last night, the South dominated national affairs, but with a majority of presidents and House speakers, and we dominated the Supreme Court in 1860. There were many Northerners that believed that, including Northern presidents. If you think about it, we only had one nationalist president during that 60 years, and that was John Quincy Adams, and he stole his election and got run off after one term. So people didn't like that kind of stuff at all. As Eugene Genovese has written, the states' rights interpretation of the Constitution has always had numerous supporters in the North. Southerners never cease to remind their Yankee tormentors that not only states' rights, but secessionist doctrine had played well in New England well before the Hartford Convention. If anything, regional particularism and states' rights doctrine were stronger in the North than in the South until after the War of 1812. Despite Jeffersonian dominance, the great political divide in the country remained. Some portray the rift as a Jeffersonian versus Hamiltonian contest. But since Lincoln brought Jefferson's vision to fruition, and as Don Livingston has so masterfully pointed out, the two competing visions for the nation is in actuality Jeffersonian America versus Lincolnian America. And these vast differences were reflected in their political philosophies, the way they believed the country should be governed, as well as the foundation upon which it rested. Jeffersonians believed in a decentralized state, a union or compact among the states, where sovereignty rested with the people of the states, and it was those sovereign states that came together to create the Constitution, delegating certain enumerated powers to a new federal government, while retaining all others for themselves, and always with the understanding that those delegated powers could be recalled at any time. And for you younger students in here, when you're doing your research, pay attention to how many times Americans in that time period, even Northerners, referred to the country as a confederacy. It's all through letters and things at the time. Now, these ideals are what most Americans, not just Southerners, understood to be absolute political truth. William Rawle, a very prominent attorney from Philadelphia who wrote a book called A View of the Constitution in 1825, the textbook used at West Point, he remarked that, quote, "The Union is an association of the people of republics. Its preservation is calculated to depend on the preservation of those republics." And he refers to the country as a compact. He writes, "The secession of a state from the Union depends on the will of the people of such a state." In other words, it's the will of the people of that state to determine secession, not the will of the American people or the national government or anything like that. Now, Lincolnians, people like Lincoln, Daniel Webster, Joseph Story, people like that, believed in the concept of a perpetual national union, whereby the whole of the American people were deemed sovereign. They created the Constitution, Webster said, "We the people," whatever that is. And the states were nothing more than provinces under this system, to be dominated and controlled by a central authority. A view that really did not exist until about the 1830s. As Kenneth Stamp has written, the Jeffersonian idea of state sovereignty and a constitutional right of secession flourished for 40 years before a comparable case for a perpetual union had been devised. In other words, they didn't have any answer to it for 40 years. That's how we know it's not political truth. If it's truth, it would have showed up the first day. It took them 40 years to figure out what to say in answer to Jefferson and others. So it was this system of state sovereignty supported by nullification and secession that could preserve and peaceably keep the Union together. John C. Calhoun contended that the great conservative principle of our system is in the people of the states as parties to the constitutional compact, conservative being to preserve or maintain. Senator Willie P. Mangum of North Carolina, he was a very anti-Jackson guy, but refused to call himself a Whig, so he ran on an anti-Jackson ticket in 1836 for president. He agreed with Calhoun, wrote in 1834 to a friend and fellow Southerner that, quote, "The principles that you and I hold to be the only conservative principles of our federal system so far having taken root in the North and the East are scarcely comprehended by the most intelligent of the national Republicans." Now he's talking about the forerunners to the Whigs. "The basis of all our party organization in the North and East is naked interest. Principles are silly things as contradistinguished from pecuniary interest. New England has a principle that we abhor and believe to be destructive ultimately to our system in case it should prevail." Now, what he's talking about, what abhors him is centralization and nationalism, this nationalist thought here. This push toward the creation of a centralized state began with the increase of the New England Yankee as a distinct group of people in both numbers and influence, Yankees being the polar opposite of Jeffersonians. Now, there's a Northern intellectual from Vermont named Orestes Brownson, and he understood this mindset very well, and he wrote about the mindset of these New England Yankees, and I'm going to read this rather lengthy quote. But see who comes to your mind as I read this. "The New Englander has excellent points, but is restless in body and mind, always scheming, always in motion, never satisfied with what he has, and always seeking to make all the world like himself or as uneasy as himself. He is smart, seldom great, educated, but seldom learned, active in mind, but rarely a profound thinker, religious, but thoroughly materialistic. His worship is rendered in a temple founded on mammon, and he expects to be carried to heaven in a softly cushioned railway car, and his sins carefully checked and deposited in the baggage crate with his other luggage to be duly delivered when he has reached his destination. He is philanthropic, but makes his philanthropy his excuse for meddling with everybody's business as if it were his own. And under the pretense of promoting religion and morality, he wars against every generous and natural instinct and aggravates the very evils he seeks to cure. Now, who did you think of? Hillary? But abolitionist as well. This is a perfect description of the Hamiltonian or Lincolnian mindset, the Yankee mindset, specifically of the abolitionists, who sought through their magnanimity to reach down into southern states, abolish slavery immediately, upset the entirety of southern society without so much as a ripple of disruption to the north. And it's not because they cared about enslaved black people. They didn't care anything about that. As Salmon P. Chase said in 1859, he wrote, "I do not wish to have the slave emancipated because I love him, but because I hate his master." First time I heard that, I said, that's got to be fake, until I found it, and it's not. That should tell you a lot. It's about destroying the Jeffersonian South. Now, Jeffersonians as a whole, Southerners in particular, never sought to do this to the North, unlike Northern conspiracy theories of the day. As Calhoun once asked, when did the South ever lay her hand upon the North? Well, I can answer that easy, never. By the 1850s and 1860s, this view was becoming widespread, and the differences between the two pervasive philosophies more apparent. As Professor Clyde Wilson has written in a great new book that you need to get, it's right back there on that table, The Yankee Problem, An American Dilemma, he wrote, quote, "The North had been Yankeeized for the most part quietly by control of churches, schools, and other cultural institutions, and by whipping up a frenzy of paranoia about the alleged plot of the South to spread slavery to the North, which was as imaginary as Jefferson's guillotine." Now that was the conspiracy theory, that the South was going to somehow push slavery into the North, which wasn't true. They just used that to frighten people, and that's exactly the theme of Lincoln's House Divided speech in 1858, if you read it. As James Henley Thornwell of South Carolina wrote in 1859, "There is at work in this land a Yankee spirit and an American spirit." And that Yankee spirit was working against this Jeffersonian ideal. In other words, what he was saying, this Yankee spirit is un-American. It's advocating un-American things. Jefferson, as politically astute as he was, saw these differences very early and wrote about them more than 6 decades before secession, during the darkest days of the Adams administration, when he was serving as vice president, when they had passed the Alien and Sedition Acts. To his friend John Taylor of Caroline, he wrote, this is his famous Reign of Witches letter, 1798. He said, "The young country was, quote, completely under the saddle of Massachusetts and Connecticut, who ride us very hard, cruelly insulting our feelings as well as exhausting our strength and substance." New Englanders, and he was in agreement with Brownson when he said, New Englanders display a great perversity of character. This is the reason we have natural division in our parties, he said. In other words, they're the problem, not us. They're the ones causing the problem. He saw this 60 years before secession. By the 1850s, the meddling of the New England Yankee was creeping in, becoming more apparent. And we can look at a bunch of examples of that, and I won't take time to do that, but you can look through the antebellum period. Those ideas were creeping in, talking to government about giving, help for widows, and they passed a bill in 1854 to give federal help to the mentally insane under Franklin Pierce, a great Jeffersonian. And Pierce vetoed that bill, saying, "I can find no power, no authority in the Constitution to help the indigent insane," and mentioned a compact and things like that. So there are certainly examples of that happening. And now this growing political divide eventually came to a head with the emergence of a purely sectional party, the new Republican Party, the party of Lincoln, conceived in 1854 after the Kansas-Nebraska Act was passed. The party grew rapidly by coalescing many different elements within it: old Northern Whigs, various abolitionist parties, anti-Nebraska Democrats, anti-Lecompton Democrats. And so the South certainly saw the dangers apparent with the Republicans, but some Northerners did as well. Millard Fillmore, who people usually beat up as a bad president, wrote this: "If this sectional party succeeds, it leads inevitably to the destruction of this beautiful fabric reared by our forefathers." cemented by their blood and bequeathed to us as a priceless inheritance. In other words, they're going to wreck it. They're going to destroy it. James Buchanan saw the same problem, and that's what he said: the storm of frenzy and faction must inevitably dash itself in vain against the unshaken rock of the Constitution. In other words, if we stick with the Constitution, stick with these principles, everything will be fine. We can survive these political storms that he saw ahead. But that was the problem. Would the Republicans follow the Constitution? Many Northern Yankees had already demonstrated a great propensity toward lawlessness and interpreting the Constitution any way they chose, reserving the right to violate it for the noblest of reasons, thinking about Brownson. They first nominated a candidate in 1856, an explorer named John C. Fremont. The platform, though, in 1856 for the Republicans was very simple. It was just a platform for protection of this federal territories, to keep slavery out, which really means keep black people out of the territories, and little else. But in just that election, they were only a 2-year-old party, and they were pretty close to winning. The Democrats only got 45% of the vote because of the know-nothings. 2 years later, in 1858, in a fusion with other factions, the Republicans elected a U.S. Speaker of the House. So the South was beginning to see the political handwriting on the wall here. But by 1860, the Republican Party had taken on a new appearance because they added vast economic proposals to their platform. So look at the two platforms sometime together and see how different they are. They essentially adopted the old program of Hamilton and Henry Clay's American system. The nominee for 1860 was not some erratic adventurer, but a serious politician who was himself an economic animal, Lincoln of Illinois, who referred to himself as a Henry Clay tariff Whig. Lincoln was in fact a Hamiltonian who believed in the merits of big government, but most particularly in the area of economics. If you've read Professor Bort's book, Gaboris Bort from Gettysburg College, he's got a great book called Lincoln and the Economics of the American Dream. And he says, if you look at Lincoln's career before he became president, before the war and all that, way more than half of everything Lincoln wrote or said was about economics. It wasn't about the sections or slavery or anything like that. It was about the tariff and the bank and the currency and federal money for internal improvements and building railroads and that kind of thing. That dominated Lincoln's thinking. Bort and David Herbert Donald called Lincoln the Whig in the White House. Lincoln always considered himself a Whig, always. And he wanted to put that Whig program in place. The plan of what he called his beau ideal of a statesman, which was Henry Clay. Such a plan was greatly concerning to the Jeffersonian South, realizing that the high tariff was designed to enrich the North, deplete the South, and reward well-connected cronies such as railroad magnates and other corporate hacks, who would also gain federal funding for internal improvements that would also benefit the North, while the bank would fund it and perhaps be as crooked and corrupt as it had been under Nicholas Biddle. Remember, the South was responsible for about 75% at least of the revenue coming into the Treasury. In short, the new Lincoln government, based exclusively on Hamiltonian principles, would most assuredly intervene in the internal affairs of the southern states and plunder them like never before. Jerry C. Brewer has written in a great book called Dismantling the Republic. It's also by Shotwell. Northern interests were at work to turn the Jeffersonian Republic into a, quote, consolidated mercantile empire. No question about it. But Lincoln and his philosophy were also dangerous in another regard. He claimed to hold the Declaration of Independence in the highest regard, even higher than the Constitution. And he once referred to the American Revolution as a struggle for national independence by a single people. Now, his inference of a single people, and that's who he considered Northerners and Southerners to be, all Americans, was that the country could not legally break up. He denied the right of any state to secede from the Union. As he once said in his first inaugural, physically speaking, we cannot separate. We cannot remove our respective sections from each other, nor build an impassable wall between them. A husband and wife may be divorced and go out of the presence and beyond the reach of each other, but the different parts of our country cannot do this. He believed in that American people concept, we the people, the same philosophy as Daniel Webster. Of this, Jefferson Davis said, the monstrous conception of the creation of a new people invested with the whole or a great part of the sovereignty which had previously belonged to the people of each state has not a syllable to sustain it in the Constitution. Not one syllable. So by November of 1860, it was apparent to many Southerners, particularly after the horrors of John Brown's raid the year before, that the country was about to undergo a sweeping change, or a transformation, if you will. With Lincoln and his new party that was completely sectional in its nature, they had won the election with 39% of the vote. A party that was concerned only with Northern opinion, Northern principles, Northern ideals, Northern policies, specifically these economic policies. In 1861, Southerners were completely exacerbated by the threats of the North. They determined to create a government of their own, one reflecting their own principles. And they believed they had every right to do so as believers of the right of self-determination of peoples. That's the heart of the Declaration of Independence, which Lincoln supposedly admires so much. But he didn't even understand it. The contrast then between the Northern and Southern governments was vast. As the London Times opined on May the 7th, 1861, their editors wrote, "The South wants independence, the North wants empire." Lincoln and most presidents after him, being of the Hamiltonian mode of thinking, established all of the central tenets of Hamilton's political thought. After Southern secession, they got right to work with a national banking system, a national currency. I think they raised the tariff 7 times in 4 years. Passed the Pacific Railway Act, the Homestead Act, Land Grant College Act, an income tax that didn't expire until 1872, money for corporations. They suppressed civil liberties. If you could criticize Lincoln, you got locked up. About 14,000 people in the North did. The Confederacy, as a government under Jefferson Davis, was administered on Jeffersonian principles, the polar opposite of Lincoln. The Confederate Constitution, Don talked a lot about that last night, was really the culmination of Jeffersonian political thought. Much like the U.S. Constitution, that's because Southerners believed that that was their birthright. So a lot of Southerners wrote that. That's our birthright. That's our heritage. That's why we're keeping it with some changes, which made it only more Jeffersonian. I won't go into those changes. Don talked a lot about them last night, particularly my favorite part, which can be found in Article 1, Section 2, Clause 5, where the states can impeach and remove not only any federal judicial officer, but any officer, federal official, FBI, whatever, Gestapo, whatever. The ones I ran into trouble with yesterday in Dallas, which was the TSA, that seized and took away all my stuff, and I had to go buy some more last night. So I wish we'd have had that in place. Now this is really the heart and soul of the whole thing, the protection of states' rights. I mean, they say it wasn't about states' rights, but look at all the protections for the states. The states were stronger in the Confederacy, not weaker. There are other differences we could talk about. They had mentioned God in the preamble. That's pretty good. President's 6-year term, line item veto, all that good stuff Don talked about. It also removed the general welfare clause. I think that's good. Prohibited federally funded internal improvements. Today we call them earmarks, right? Keep up with earmarks. My favorite one, we spent $500,000 to watch a shrimp run on a treadmill. They spent several $1 million one time to study to study the gambling habits of monkeys. They taught monkeys how to play poker and sit there and watch them and see what they'd do. I was happy to contribute to that. Or the rabbit massages and all that kind of stuff. You wouldn't have had that because it took 2/3 vote to pass an appropriations bill. You couldn't get 2/3 for garbage like who knows, maybe you could. It forbid recess appointments. And one final thing it did, and I think you'll like this, it prohibited persons of foreign birth who had not obtained citizenship from voting for any office on the state or federal level. Now you think, well, what do they have that for? Do they have that kind of problem? Yeah. Those northern political machines were pouring in immigrants and having them vote. I mean, if it was an election the day you got off the boat, you could vote early and often. So they put that in there. It's interesting, if you saw the news recently, there was a think tank that just concluded a study that said that 5 to 6 million foreigners voted in our last 3 presidential elections. 5 to 6 million. So we need that in our Constitution. Now, all of these provisions upheld the Jeffersonian ideal. Now let us consider an important question here that I want to pose. Was this movement for Southern self-government an act of revolution? Some have said it is. There's a book by Emory Thomas, The Confederacy as a Revolutionary Experiment. And for some of you students, particularly starting grad school, you're going to spend a lot of time in grad school reading a bunch are very bad books from establishment historians and academic presses. They're just horrible. And a lot of times what they'll do is they will change the definition of words to fit what they want it to say. And I used to argue with my professors all the time about that. Why don't we let them buy with that? And they would always say, well, just let them have it. Well, I wouldn't let them have it. I prefer the dictionary to get my definitions. Here's a good definition for revolution: a forcible overthrow of a government or social order in favor of a new system. Now, does that sound like something the South did, or does that sound like something Lincoln did? I think the answer should be obvious. The South stand was no more a revolution than what America's fathers had done in 1776. And I don't call it with my students a revolution, American Revolution. In my opinion, not a revolution. But there's little question that Lincoln's actions were revolutionary. The South understood and saw very clearly that Lincoln and the Republicans, what they were up to, they seceded in order to save and preserve the Jeffersonian ideal and govern themselves, just as Americans had done 85 years before. Lincoln invaded not to overthrow slavery, but to conquer the South in Jeffersonian governance and fasten on the nation his nationalistic economic policies in precisely the same stance as the mother country. So the South is really in the same position that the Americans were in 1775, 76. Lincoln's in the position of the King of England. As he said in his famous letter to Horace Greeley, this is Lincoln in 1862, the sooner the national authority can be restored, the nearer the Union will be the Union as it was, meaning to restore the national authority over the states. James Henley Thornwell of South Carolina, the great theologian, wrote of these issues in the midst of the war in a book called Our Danger and Our Duty, published in 1862, and you can find it online. Here's what he said about the differences. The consequences of our success on our part will be very different from the consequences of success on the part of the North. If they prevail, the whole character of the government will be changed. And instead of a federal republic, the common agent of sovereign and independent states, we shall have a central despotism, with the notion of states forever abolished, deriving its power from the will and shaping its policy according to the wishes of a numerical majority of the people. We shall have, in other words, a supreme, irresponsible democracy. On the other hand, he says, we are struggling for constitutional freedom. We are upholding the great principles which our fathers bequeathed us. And if we should succeed and become, as we shall, the dominant nation of this continent, we shall perpetuate and diffuse the very liberty for which Washington bled and which the heroes of the Revolution achieved. We are not revolutionists. We are resisting revolution. We are upholding the true doctrines of the federal Constitution. We are conservative. Our success is the triumph of all that has been considered established in the past. And he's got it 100% right. That's exactly what it was on both parts. Others saw this as well. Consider in 1860 there were 4 ex-presidents of the United States still alive and well. And soon to be James Buchanan was about to be the 5th. Yet all 5 of them opposed Lincoln. All 5 of them opposed his election. All 5 of them worked to derail it. All 5 of them opposed what he was doing. They understood what was happening to the country. And a revolution is exactly what we had. Consider what the governor of Lincoln's home state said in 1865. Richard Yates wrote this: the war has tended more than any other event in the history of the country to militate against the Jeffersonian idea that the best government is that which governs least. The war has not only of necessity given more power to, but has led to a more intimate prevision of the government over every material interest of society. That's exactly what Hamilton and Lincoln wanted. Confederate General Richard Taylor, Zachary Taylor's son, when he came back home after the war, found that, quote, society has been completely changed by the war. The French Revolution of 1789 did not produce a greater change in the ancien regime than has this in our social life. In other words, the world's upside down and backwards. Even a historian in 1869, just 4 years after the war, wrote this: the war left a great gulf between what happened before it in our century and what has happened since, or what is likely to happen thereafter. It does not seem to me as if I were living in the country in which I was born. So Lincoln's revolution destroyed the age of Jefferson. And you see this with modern scholars. Lincoln cultists. James M. McPherson in a book called Abraham Lincoln and the Second American Revolution. Of course, these guys think it's good. They think it's wonderful what happened. McPherson writes, after the war, the old decentralized federal republic became a new national polity that taxed the people directly, created an internal revenue bureau to collect these taxes, expanded the jurisdiction of the federal courts, established a national currency and a national banking system, again, to destroy the Union and to create a nation. We were not a nation before the war. Another historian, Heather Cox Richardson, said that Lincoln and his party had transformed the United States. A strong central government was created, dominated the post-war nation. The nation had boasted of a military of over 1 million men, carried a national debt of $2.5 billion, and collected an array of new internal taxes, provided a national currency, distributed public lands, chartered corporations, and enforced the freedom of former slaves within state borders. Every bit of this flew in the face of Jeffersonian conservatism, the Jeffersonian tradition. So we basically, that constitutional republic was destroyed by this war of northern aggression. And really this was nothing short of a crime. One northerner, a guy named Henry Clay Dean, if you've ever heard of Henry Clay Dean, is a Methodist Episcopal preacher and a Copperhead. He was from Pennsylvania and lived in Iowa at the time of the war. Actually got locked up for a couple of weeks for some of his speeches. He's featured in Mark Twain's book, Life on the Mississippi. And in 1869, he wrote a book entitled The Crimes of the Civil War and the Curse of the Funding System. You can find it on Google Books. And I want to read to you the dedication, who he dedicated this book to. This is a northerner here. 4 different groups of people. And I think you'll get a lot out of this. The first group was northerners like he was. To the brave men who, unmoved by the violence of party, unseduced by the temptations of wealth, and unawed by the cruelty of war, defended the priceless treasures of constitutional liberty, endured banishment, tortures, and death, rather than surrender their birthright, transmitted by the fathers of 1776. Second group was Union soldiers who were decent and upright, he called them. To those upright soldiers who, through 5 years of carnage, corruption, plunder, rape, and desolation, preserved their hands unstained with innocent blood, their souls unpolluted with plunder, and maintained their manhood inviolate. The third group was just working people in the North. To the laboring poor, whose subsistence is devoured by the combinations of monopoly, bankruptcy, usury, extortion, standing armies, tax gatherers, and usurpation. Finally, the fourth group was Confederate soldiers. To the immortal dead, who surrendered their lives in defense of the honor and safety of their homes and poured out their rich blood in rich libations to the God of liberty. Now, he just got his belt off and took him to the woodshed with that. But that's a revolution. He's describing a revolution here. Of course, the crimes didn't end with Reconstruction, with the war. They continued with 12 years of Reconstruction. As Orestes Brownson wrote, the attitudes prevailing in 1864, about the time the war was ending, about the time they were starting to think about reconstructing the states here. He said this, "We have some madmen amongst us who talk of exterminating the Southern leaders and of New Englandizing the South. We wish to see the free labor system substituted for the slave labor system, but beyond that we have no wish to exchange or modify Southern society, and would rather approach Northern society to it rather than it to Northern society." And that's revolution. That's what revolutions do. They exterminate the other side, destroy them, turn the world upside down. And that's what a lot of them were trying to do. A lot of the fanatics, the madmen he's talking about, Thaddeus Stevens and people like that, were openly talking about this stuff. Senator Zachariah Chandler of Michigan said it this way, talking about treating the South as conquered provinces and an enemy. He said, "A rebel has sacrificed all of his rights. He has no right to life, liberty, property, or the pursuit of happiness. Everything he has, even life itself, he has forfeited it." So you don't have any rights anymore. Thaddeus Stevens said the South should be laid waste and made a desert and then repopulated with people from the North and repeopled with a band of freedmen. That's what a lot of them wanted to do. They hated the South. They hated Southern institutions, particularly this Jeffersonian philosophy of government, which they hoped to destroy for good. They wanted the complete subjugation of the region, vindictive punishment of the rebels, the overthrow of all Southern state governments, confiscation of all land and homes, and then send good people down there to repopulate. In other words, take the South, turn it into the North. That's what they were talking about openly doing. Sweep away all vestiges of Southern culture. It would not exist anymore, which is kind of what we're hearing today, right? Get rid of all of it. No more reminders of these things. Lincoln had one conservative Democrat in his cabinet, the Navy Secretary, Gideon Welles, and he called this plan an atrocious scheme of plunder and robbery, and so it was. So it seems as though this war and Reconstruction had destroyed this Jeffersonian ideal, destroyed this entire tradition. It did receive a brief revival under Grover Cleveland, who I've written about. I won't go into a whole lot of what Cleveland did, but Cleveland saw himself in that same mold as Jefferson. He really liked Jefferson and the founders, and he wanted to do exactly the same thing Jefferson had done in 1800 in 1884 when he got elected. That was the first Democrat since James Buchanan. A quarter century of Republican rule, corruption, spending, and all that stuff. He says, time to turn the tide, turn the clock back, and that's what he tried to do. And the Lincolnians of his day fought really hard to destroy him. His first term in 1885, 1889, as you know, Cleveland served 2 non-consecutive terms. He's the one that screwed up our numbering system because he's the 22nd and 24th president, counted twice, messed it up. But after a quarter century of Republican policies, Cleveland entered office and instituted honest government, ended presidential luxury just like Jefferson had done, slashed the bureaucracy, stopped the out-of-control spending. He vetoed 414 bills in his first term, more than 100 a year. A lot of them were the pension bills that Don was talking about. That pension program, one scholar called that the first federal welfare program, which is exactly what it is, as well as a vote-buying scheme. Protected a massive budget surplus of over $100 million and reduced the national debt by 20%. That's a pretty good first term. Defeated for re-election, even though he won the popular vote in 1888, which he probably won, but there's a lot of vote fraud in that one. But he came back in 1892 for a second term, a non-consecutive term, because of what was happening with his beloved Jeffersonian Democratic Party. They were beginning to change their character. Dumping some of those Jeffersonian ideals. And he saw it. And he said, no, I've got to step back in here and try to stop that. And so his second term from 1893 to 1897 was pretty bad because the worst depression up until that point hit the country. The Republicans successfully branded it as a Democratic Depression. And Cleveland came in with a Democratic Congress. It was the first time Jeffersonians controlled the government since 1858. And that panic of 1893 really killed Jeffersonian conservatism, at least for a time. And so the Democrats then in the 1890s, beginning in 1896, with William Jennings Bryan, not Wilson, but William Jennings Bryan in 1896, began to adopt some of these Hamiltonian, Lincolnian policies. But consider now a few proposals that had happened during the Gilded Age. When you study the Gilded Age, people tend to say, well, it's really a time of laissez-faire conservatism and small government. No, not at all. And there was also some very wild ideas that came about because Lincoln has opened up the door here. There was a peacetime income tax that was passed in the 1890s. And it was passed for the specific purpose of redistributing wealth. That's what they said. That was the reason for doing it. Taxing the wealthy, people like the Rockefellers and the Carnegies, and redistributing it. Of course, we had a Jeffersonian Supreme Court that knocked it down in 1895. It's unconstitutional. That's when we have the 16th Amendment. The worst amendment ever, along with the 17th. There was another wealth redistribution scheme. Consider this one. And this was talked about by President Rutherford B. Hayes. They would cap inheritance at $500,000, and everything above that would be confiscated by the government and distributed to those that were less fortunate. That one didn't go anywhere, but the ideas are out there. In the Panic of 1893, during Cleveland's second term, there was a proposal for a New Deal-style public works program where the government would spend $500 million in new paper money on public works. It was a forerunner to the New Deal. Congress said no, but those ideas are out there. So by the time Cleveland left office, and he was in bad shape politically. If you could run a poll on Cleveland in 1897, his poll numbers would have probably been 10% maybe if at all. But he happily went to the House, and William Jennings Bryan became the nominee, and the party changed. It had been swallowed up by populism and what would become progressivism. So by the early 20th century, one disgruntled old Jeffersonian Cleveland Democrat wrote that the party as we knew it is dead. And it is. And I'll conclude with this. As the columnist George Will has written, we honor Jefferson but live in Hamilton's country. And so it is. But in reality, I say we live in Lincoln's country. Our political heritage of Jeffersonian thought, ideals, seems as though it died with Grover Cleveland because it's never been resurrected. We don't have a party that espouses that. The Republican Party. I know a lot about the Republican Party. It doesn't espouse that at all. It only lives today in the hearts of true sons of the South and true sons of Jefferson. As Senator Willie P. Mangum of North Carolina wrote, it is Southerners, he said, that were the, quote, real conservators of our political system. And I think that's true. We are the ones that keep it alive. As John F. Kennedy once said, a man may die, nations may rise and fall, but an idea lives on. Indeed, though the radicals today are trying to destroy and kill what's left of our traditions, as one popular movie in Hollywood, one line from that movie, ideas, ladies and gentlemen, are bulletproof. Thank you very much.